So you guys want to execute stored procedures while using Entity Framework 6? Maybe you just don't want to use LINQ queries for any number of reasons. Well then, you're at the right place. I want you guys to leave this video with a better understanding of what are stored procedures and how to properly call them within the .NET environment using Entity Framework. But importantly, you do need to know the current limitations of Entity Framework 6 when doing this. So remember to stick through the whole video so you don't miss any of these key points. But let's not waste any more time. Let's get into the topic of stored procedures with Entity Framework using a .NET 6 API. And if you end up finding this video useful, please drop a like on the video so it can spread to more developers, and subscribe if you would like. Thank you. Okay, so quickly, I just want to talk about what are stored procedures, how they compare with LINQ, and how they work with Entity Framework 6 and their limitations. So let's dive into that very quickly. What are stored procedures? They're basically stored SQL code that you can reuse over and over and just call, and it'll execute the same thing. It's kind of how you reuse code and make it its own method, and then you just call it from other methods. Basically the same concept, except with SQL code. So why would you even use stored procedures over using LINQ? LINQ is really easy, right? Easy to use within .NET. Well, yes, but stored procedures are slightly faster than LINQ queries since they can take full advantage of SQL, and they can be cached since they live in the database. Since they are SQL, you can also be way more complex with the queries because you don't have to worry about performance like you do with LINQ. And then you offload having to parse and then create the query like you have to do with LINQ, because again, stored procedures are SQL and they already live in the database, so you don't have to then process anything. It just works, executes, and sends back your result. But now I want to touch on the limitations of Entity Framework 6 with stored procedures. All this information comes from the Microsoft documentation, which I will be linking below if you want to go check that out. But basically, there's some limitations and some things that you just can't really do or not easy to do with this, and you're better off using a do.net or some other third-party library to call stored procedures in .NET instead of using Entity Framework 6. So SQL queries must return data for all properties of the entity type. What does this mean? Basically, if you have a class with certain fields, you have to return data for all of them when you query the database. Or when your stored procedure comes back for a certain table, it has to return data for every single one. You can't miss any. So column names must match column names. So that means they have to match. You can't name them other things and expect them to line up, because you can't do any of that pre-processing, because the stored procedure just sends all this data to Entity Framework, and then Entity Framework has to map them all. And so that can be confusing and it'll throw an error. Also, it cannot contain related data. So basically, what is my recommendation? What does this all mean? It basically means that join queries inside of your stored procedure, or queries that grab from a lot of different tables, are impossible to do. You cannot do them. Why? Because you are only allowed to basically use stored procedures on one table at a time. If you use more than one table in your SQL query, it'll work in SQL, but when that data comes back, Entity Framework 6 will not be able to map it. So basically, my recommendation is, for calling stored procedures, unless it's a very simple one table stored procedure select query, basically only do this method with creating, updating, or deleting. Unless it is a very simple selecting from one table, then you can kind of do this. I don't see a massive benefit of doing this, but I still want to show you guys how to do it if you guys do want to use Entity Framework 6 in your .NET project to call a stored procedure. But that is my recommendation for you. But keep an eye out for Entity Framework 7, because I think they might fix this issue of being so closely tied to the entity types. But with that being said, let's dive into the code so I can show you guys how to actually do this in a .NET application. Okay, so this is the project that I'm going to be using, that I'm going to be adding the stored procedures to. It's a project that I already used in a previous video. There'll be a card. It's one where I created an Angular 14 application with a .NET 6 API. So that's where this, API came from. If you guys want to go check out that video or have interest in that, there'll be a card at the top. But let me just show you guys kind of what's here. And I'll show you guys the database as well. So basically, there are 4 API calls where it's just CRUD. So it's a get, a post, a put, and a delete. So that's all this is. Those methods are going to work, but we're not going to be working in this. Let me show you guys quickly the database. So the only thing different, if you guys were maybe one of the people that actually saw that previous video, is now I have 2 tables. So basically, I have a table for players and a table for teams. So if you look in the players, all we have is Neymar, Mbappe, Messi, and Vinicius Jr. And then we now have a foreign key of team ID that points to this primary key, which just has 3 team names. That is it. You guys will know why it exists in a bit whenever I show you kind of one of the limitations, let's say. But that's going to exist. So first thing I want to do is let's create kind of the controller, the interface, and the repository that we are going to. So first things first, I'm going to create a SP controller, basically just stored procedures controller. That's just where I kind of want to have them all. I have this SP controller now. This is where I want to have all my stored procedures. So I kind of just have them in one place, and this is like where I'm going to go to call them. So now I just need to add a few things to get going. I'm going to need to use the interfaces. That will be coming later when to actually create the interface for this. Let's put its decorators to make sure that it is a controller. I just want to use controller base, even though they're basically the same thing. Doesn't really matter. We need a constructor. This constructor is going to be SP controller. And we are going to need to call the repository once we actually create it. So it'll be empty now because it doesn't exist yet, but we will create it in a second. And with that, I might as well go ahead and create it. So I need to create the interface and then the repository. So those are the two next things to create. So I'm going to go into the interfaces and I'm going to create the ISP repository because that's going to be the interface for the repository. Now that I have this created, I want to add in the 5 methods or the 5 stored procedures that I will be showing you guys in this tutorial. So with that being said, I'm going to put them in here. We'll create them in a second. So we are going to have a GetPlayer. This is basically going to be a stored procedure that just goes and gets one specific player based on his name and jersey number. Next, we're going to have a stored procedure that just selects all from a given player list. Next, we have a very special one. This is one where I want to teach a lesson per se. It is going to be the GetPlayerList. This is basically going to get all the players from the player table, but then also go and get the team information from that secondary table with that foreign key that I just showed you guys. We're going to have an UpdatePlayer, which this one is not going to be a read at all. Like it says, it's going to update a player. So based on the team ID and the player ID, it's going to go and update the team ID. Let's say a soccer player changes teams. We want to go change the team name. And then we're going to create a player. Normal thing, we just want to add another player to our database. So we need the team name, and jersey number because the ID will be created once it's inserted. So now let's go to the repository and actually create our repository. So I've created the repository. Now let's actually start doing all the setup for this so that we can connect it to the controller, to the interface, and do all that stuff correctly. So first thing we're going to need is we are going to need our interfaces in here. Let me scoot this down a little bit, put this up here. We are going to need the ISP repository. That's going to go right there because inside of that are all the definitions of the methods that we have to now implement. I also want to add in our DB context, which is our sample database context. That is what the database was called, just sample database with those 2 tables. And then we're going to need a constructor as well. Boom. And the last thing is we need to go to our program.cs and we need to actually add in the connection so that we know that our repository is going to use that given interface. So we have to put that in our program so that it knows to add that dependency. Let's add that in here. Boom, we're all good to go. So now we have the repository, the interface, and the controller. So let's start with the first one. We're going to start with GetPlayer. So first of all, we need to create the stored procedure. Once we create the stored procedure, then we can come back to the code and now connect everything to actually call it. So let's go and create the stored procedure. Well, now we're back in SSMS and let's actually go down here to programmability in the stored procedure. This is where you actually are going to create your stored procedures within a database. So right click it, new stored procedure. And then you're looking here, a bunch of template code, but really you go down here. This is where you're going to name it. So replace this with GetPlayer. Here is where you add parameters. Ours is actually going to have 2 parameters since we are getting a player. How do you get a player? Well, you need their jersey number and their name. And then here you have sample code, but this is basically where you write your SQL query. For those of you who are familiar with SQL, we're just going to have a very simple query using both those parameters. So we're going to do a select everything from player. So if you look at player, we're basically selecting this whole row. We're not doing a join, just selecting the row where the name equals the name and the jersey number equals the jersey number. So now we run this whole thing, command succeeded, go down here and we refresh. And we'll see that we now have this GetPlayer created. If we go to modify it, we'll see everything. We're using the correct database, the GetPlayer is named correctly, your parameters, and then your queries all there. If you want to test it in here, you can just execute it, pass in some quick values so we can see that it works. And this is what you're returning. So now the next thing you actually want to do is you want to call it from your API. So let's go ahead and go do that. Okay, so now that we're back at our stored procedures controller, the next thing we want to do is just quickly create this method. This method is just going to be the GetPlayer method. Very simple. We are defining, the route to it. We are saying that we are returning a player object, and we are just calling the repository method that is GetPlayer, which we have defined in here. So now going back, now we have to go create the actual method in the repository so that we can actually access the stored procedure. So now let's go there. Okay, so now that we're at the repository, the first thing I want to do is I just want to do the kind of base implementations of all these, just so this interface can just be happy. And now we're going to go back to the GetPlayer, which is the one we were actually doing. Let me move over the code and let's set this up. So right here, it's going to throw an error because this needs to be async, but that is okay. We just do this, and then I'm not going to handle this null error. So I want to explain this code and why exactly it is this way. What happens here is we have our context, obviously, and then we are acting on the specific players table. There is a version where you can say database, but database does not work. It does not work for calling stored procedures. You have to act on a given entity, a DB set, a table, which is why it becomes an issue. In a little bit, I'll explain the issue in the other example in this one, the GetPlayerList. I'll explain. But when you use it, you're going to have two options. You're going to have from SQL raw right here and from SQL interpolated. From SQL raw basically just takes the legit string that's here and just smacks that into the database, and then that's what's run. But SQL interpolated actually parameterizes the values that you pass in, which is the safer option. If any of you have ever done any type of security, any type of course like that, you know that you want to parameterize your SQL queries, and you do not want to put just straight up raw strings into your database because it's an easy way for your database to get hacked. So what you want to use is you want to use this, or if you use SQL raw, you want to create SQL parameters. And if you guys want to know about that, you guys can just go Google it. It's very easy and very simple. But if you just want to make it easier for yourself, just do it this way using this. And then you always have to iterate. You have to enumerate over whatever values come back here. So now let's actually test it and see if this works. Okay, so my API is running. Now let's actually test our one GetPlayer method right here. We're going to go down here. We are also, like we did in our SQL example, we're going to get Mbappe, jersey number 7. We're going to go back and we're going to get this object. So we're going to see that it hit this right here and it returned it. If you guys want to see it again, we can do it again and execute it again. We're going to see that we get a player object of 1, a model player, because it was acting on the players table. That's how it knows how to bind the model and the entity to the table, because it, like I said, whenever I was showing you guys a slide, there has to be a perfect match, which is why it wants to go and get this team ID and then the team, and more on that in a second. But with that being said, we got the object back. It all came back. And if I show you guys this object right here, look at that, the response body, we got the item that we wanted. We got this exact row back in our application, and now we can pass it to the front end. So now the next one I want to show you guys is how to get the player list. So let's get the full list of soccer players that are in this table. So what did I say? The next thing we're going to do is we're going to create the GetPlayerList method. So I already created it here, but before we go to the repository, we need to actually create it as a stored procedure in our database. So let us go do that right now. So this one's going to be very simple because we don't really need anything. We're just grabbing everything essentially. So go here. I'm going to remove all of this, and then I'm just going to write a very simple query, select from player, and that's it. We just want everything, essentially. There's nothing specific. We run everything. We execute, create it. Let us refresh this. We'll see GetPlayerList. We can execute it. We see that we get all our values back. So now let's actually create it in the repository. If we go to our repository, we see that it is right here. It is, again, going to be extremely similar to this, except there's not even going to be parameters in this one. So we're going to go in here, get the player list. We're going to see I use the exact same structure, same method. This needs to be async. And again, you have to enumerate over this. If not, this will throw you an error. It has to do it that way. So this is going to come back. We can test it again. Now we have this running. Let me actually try it out. Boom, we're going to go through. We're going to see that we're getting 4 objects back. We're getting all our players. Let's fast forward. And in our response, you see that it got all 4 of our soccer players. So that's all great. Okay, so now that you get the player list, it's logical that you want to do another CRUD operation. So let's actually create a player. So the next thing that we need to do is we need to go to our stored procedures section down here and actually create that CreatePlayer stored procedure. So we're first just going to name it CreatePlayer. Then the next thing that's slightly different from the last one is that we're going to actually have 3 parameters for this one, because to create a player, we need a jersey number, a name, and then that team ID to fulfill that foreign key to whatever team the player plays on. And then our query is going to be a little different because it is not just reading. This one's going to be actually inserting into the player's table. And how do we do that? You insert into player, you pass in the column names here, and then the values, which are these variables. And then you run. Refresh. It's all here. Everything's good. Let's go look at it. Our query looks fine. So now let's actually go back to the code and actually create a player through the stored procedure kind of workflow. Now that we're back at the controller, let's actually create the controller method, and then let's actually do what we need in the repository to actually call the CreatePlayer stored procedure that we just created. So what does our controller method going to look like? Very easily and very simply, it's going to look like this: the CreatePlayer route, and then we are just receiving these 3 values. And then we are calling the repository and passing in those 3 values. Very simple. Nothing's changed from that except we are returning int. Because now here, we are not actually receiving things. The only thing that we're going to receive is how many rows were affected or what changes to how many rows happened. So that's why it's an int. So now let's go to the repository and do that whole thing. Now that we're in the repository, this is what our code is going to look like for creating a player. And I'll walk you guys through to what is going on. So again, I have to make this async. Basically, again, like I just mentioned, we're going to be returning the affected rows. So it's going to be an integer of how many rows were changed. So imagine you had a very big update to a lot of tables. Maybe a payment was made and now a date has to be updated to a lot of rows. Well, you would get how many affected rows, and then you could maybe store that number or check, is this correct? Did everything work properly? But the difference here is, if you guys notice, I'm calling the database now. I'm not calling a specific table. When you are doing an operation that is not a read, you call the database and you execute SQL interpolated async. It is not a from, it is executing. So the query stays the same as in execute the CreatePlayer stored procedure. And then again, you pass in correctly parameterized values. But this part changes where now you're calling the database object. With that being said, this works though for creating. So now let's actually create a soccer player. Now that I have this running, let us create, I don't know, let's do Ronaldinho. So let's do 10. Let's do Ronaldinho. Let's do PSG because he also played on PSG and he didn't play on any of the other 2. So let's just do Team ID 1. So you can see that we got 1 as a response because 1 thing was changed. 1 row was changed. And if we go back to our players and we select, we see that he was created successfully down here. So that works also perfectly as well. So now you might say, oh, I can create, but how do I update? What if a player changes teams? Well, we can do that as well. What do you guys think? So let's go to the stored procedure and create that one, and then we can do the code just like we've been doing. Okay, so the next one that we have to create is the update. So we are going to do UpdatePlayer. This one will also need 2 parameters to come in. Those are going to be the team ID and the player ID, because we're basically updating, hey, did this certain player go to a different team? If so, we have to change it. And with that being said, our query is not going to be super difficult or super long, and it's basically just going to be update in the player table, go to the player table and update, and then set the team ID where the player ID equals that. Makes sense, right? We're not going to create this. Everything's good. Let's refresh, make sure that it is created. We can go here, we can check, everything looks good. So now let's actually go to the code and actually interact with the stored procedure from our API. Now that we're in our controller, our method to hit our repository is going to look like this. Our route of UpdatePlayer, team ID, player ID, and again, just like the CreatePlayer, we are going to get how many rows were affected by these changes. But now let's go to the repository. In our repository, we're going to scroll down to our method, and we are going to add in our code here. Let's make this async as well. So our code is, again, very similar to the create. Again, acting on the database, very key, not on a table, but it is the same thing here. And then we have our UpdatePlayer in the string, and everything else is exactly the same. So now let's test our code. Let me restart this. Okay, so what player do I want to update? Well, let's go to our database. So Mbappe is currently on team 1, that is PSG, but we all know the rumors that he might go to Real Madrid. So let's update him. Let's see in the future he actually goes to Real. So let's change this. So player ID of 4, and he's going to go to team ID of 2. We execute that. We get a response of 1. That means one thing was changed. We can go back in here, re-execute this query, and we see that his team ID is now different. So now he technically is a member of Real Madrid, not PSG like he was just a second ago. So right there, we have our create. We've pulled data, and we've also updated a value. You guys probably noticed that I was kind of avoiding this GetPlayerList. Well, I added in all the code for it, and I just want to explain why I was avoiding it and why it was a point of pain when using Entity Framework 6 to try and grab a bunch of data. And when I mean grab a bunch of data, I tried to join the players table with the team table just strictly on this. This is a stored procedure I created for this. It is you select player as P, join team T. So this does just not work. It just doesn't work. It doesn't work in Entity Framework 6. And maybe one of you guys can figure it out. Big brain guys on YouTube can figure it out, but I can't. If you can in the comment section, let me know. But you cannot pull all of this. I even tried to change the column name of this, but since the Entity Framework 6 needs like every single value to work correctly, it actually will force you to have to change a column name, and even then it still won't work. Because it only wants to grab from the players table. It doesn't want to allow you to grab from players table and then dot include anything. That won't also work. So I just wanted to show you guys this as I tried to get it working as much as I could, and through everything I found and through the information that I showed you guys at the beginning of its limitations of it being so tightly bound to the entities and how it pulls using this like table and this literal DB set of player, it only like knows player and it doesn't know everything else. I believe that's something that they're working on with Entity Framework 7, but we'll just have to see. But I just want to kind of let you guys know that doing joins is basically just not really doable or is a lot of trouble. And at that point, I'd rather use LINQ queries. That would be way easier, or using some other third-party package to actually do the query if you really wanted to use a stored procedure for this. But with that, that's all I have for this. I showed you guys kind of how to do all the other CRUD operations, how to pull data, how to create, how to update. And it is very simple. As you see, you just have to make sure that you're using this safe way of using your parameters, because you do not want to get SQL injected. But with that being said, that is how you guys do this. But let's say you don't even like this. Let's say you're like, oh, this is way too much trouble. I'd rather just use LINQ queries. Well, then go check out this video so you can learn all about all the LINQ clauses, how to use them, what they are, and all that good stuff.